Hello and welcome to this Joseph Ranchi Foundation webinar. I'm Dave Innes, the Head of Economics at JRF, and this is the fourth webinar now in our economic discussion series on shaping a recovery that reduces poverty. If you've joined us for our previous webinars in the series, welcome back. And secondly, this one is a little bit different to the others, whereas in the others in the series, we have looked at how we're going to rebuild the post-COVID-19 economy. This one is actually about how we're going to weather the economic storm of the pandemic and how we can equip people to navigate that storm so that hopefully we can turn our attention to that recovery sooner. And to discuss the topic at hand today, I'm delighted to be joined by Jeevan Sander, an economist at King's College London, who's been working with JRF over the summer. Also joined by Gemma Tetlow, Chief Economist at the Institute for Government, and before that at the Financial Times and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Tony Wilson, who is Director of the Institute for Employment Studies. I've said Institute a lot of times in the last 30 seconds. And Tony's experience includes being at the coalface of labour market policy in the Treasury last time we were in a similar situation during the Great Recession. So you might learn from that experience today as well. And one thing that's quite remarkable about this pandemic so far, a lot of things remarkable, but one thing is that we haven't actually seen a huge increase in the official unemployment statistics so far, so stayed roughly flat so far, and that's partly because of compassionate, bold new policies such as the furlough scheme. It's also about the difficulty of measuring labour market changes that keep up with where we're at with the pandemic. And that employment rate has surely started to change by now. Seeing the BBC reporting this morning that 300,000 redundancies were planned by big companies in June and July. And it seems that we get another big company announcing redundancies almost daily at the moment. And with the furlough scheme winding down by the end of October, we do very unfortunately appear to be on the eve of a coming wave of unemployment. Now, we don't know how high that unemployment will go. The Bank of England are reasonably optimistic, expecting it to peak just below 8%. The OBR are much more pessimistic, with their central scenario suggesting unemployment will peak at more like 12%. Now, what needs to be done to support people through this coming storm? That's our central question for today. And this is how it's going to work. After this, I will hand over to Jeevan, who will present findings from a new report out today for around 10 minutes. And then we'll hear from Gemma and Tony's take on that central question for around 5 minutes each. And hopefully after that, that will give around half an hour for Q&A from our audience. So that's where you come in watching this. So do make sure you click on the Q&A button in Zoom and submit all your questions for Jeevan and Tony and Gemma. And you can also upvote via Zoom. So if you see someone else has a good question that you want answering, make sure you upvote on that to get it near the top and give it more chance of being chosen and put to our panelists today. So that's all I wanted to say by introduction. It's a very important issue at hand to discuss, and I'll hand over to Jeevan for presentation of the research.
Wonderful, thank you very much, Dave. So if I just get that up for you. Okay, well, thank you very much. And as Dave has mentioned, I'll be presenting our research on how we're going to stop the coming wave of mass unemployment caused by COVID. Before I begin, I think it's worth setting out how we got to where we are. So when COVID-19 hit, we saw people were unable to do their job due to social distancing measures. And at that time, at the time of the lockdown, the government responded with a bold and compassionate policy in the form of the furlough scheme. That kept people connected to their jobs, it protected incomes, and it stopped, as Dave's already said, mass employment and unemployment striking. Today, we're going to look at what happens if the government withdraws the support, as and when social distancing measures are still in place. And particularly, we're going to look at who's most at risk of losing their job, where those jobs will be lost, and how the government can keep firms and people afloat. Now, in order to estimate which jobs are at risk, we constructed a COVID-19 pre-vaccine job risk index. And there's really two things in mind here. The first of which is we want to see who loses their job due to enforced social distancing measures. So due to the particular features of the pandemic, who is going to lose their job because they're unable to do their job. And the second thing we look at is who's mostly likely to lose their job in a normal recession, as well as taking into account the fact that key workers' jobs are safe. In terms of enforced social distancing, COVID is spread because, well, we have to have social distancing in place because COVID is spread by people who are highly infectious and non-symptomatic. And therefore we have to ensure that people remain socially distant. And that's the reason why the government brought in the 1 meter plus and then 2 meter rule in order to enforce this social distancing and stop the spread. The virus, therefore, poses a risk to those jobs for non-workers, for those who have to work closely with other people and closely with members of the public. Closely with other people because, as we've said, the virus spreads by close contact, and with members of the public, any single member of the public can introduce the virus into a workspace. And we also analyze which workers are most likely to lose their job in a normal recession. In order to identify these jobs, we use data on job tasks about what people do in their kind of day-to-day work. How closely do you have to work with other people? How often do you work with members of the public? And this kind of data and methodology has been used elsewhere, not just in the COVID-19 literature, but also in the literature on automation, trying to figure out who's most likely to lose their job due to the coming wave of automation. So now looking at which sectors will be hit by those social distancing guidelines, what we find is that it's really close contact services that are at risk. And so we see here more than 70% of jobs in the food and beverage and personal service sector are at high or very high risk of job destruction in the next wave of COVID without further support. So we're talking about things there like, restaurant and bar staff, as well as personal care services. What we also see is that there are some close contact services, and particularly in the public sector, where jobs are unlikely to be lost. And that's because they have a high proportion of key workers within those jobs. By contrast, elsewhere in the economy, and particularly in non-close contact services, we see very few jobs are likely to be at risk. So less than 5% of jobs in the financial, professional and technical industries, as well as information and communication, are at risk of losing their job in the next stage or next phase of COVID. And that's precisely because these are the same types of job where people can zoom in and out of work, because the people who can work remotely. Yes, they work in the service sector, but they don't have to be physically close to other people in order to do their job. They're able to do their job with social distancing guidelines in place. And the same would be true, by the way, for the production, manufacturing, construction sectors that we don't show here, but that are in the report. In terms of who these people are, who are the people who work in close contact services and who are the people that work in non-close contact services, this figure here shows the relationship between pay and pre-vaccine job risk. So each of the green circles represents a key worker occupation, and the turquoise circle represents non-key worker occupations. And the size of the bubbles tells you how many people are within that job. And what we see is that for non-key workers, there is a negative relationship between job risk and hourly pay. In other words, it's low-paid non-key workers that are the most at risk in the next wave of unemployment. So in the bottom right-hand corner there, we see waiters and bar staff, sports and leisure assistants. Those are people who have to work closely with members of the public. Those are the jobs that are most at risk in the next phase of the pandemic. By contrast, in the top left-hand corner there, you see non-close contact services, economists and actuaries, statisticians, solicitors. We don't have it there, but if you had communication consultant, any kind of high-paying job in the knowledge economy, for want of a better phrase, those are the ones that will be pretty safe in the next phase of COVID. In terms of how this affects people by wages, it's worth pointing out for non-key workers, as we said, the lower paid your job, the higher the risk is of losing it. And around 40% of those at the minimum wage are at high or very high risk of losing their job, compared to less than 1% of those on more than £41,500. When thinking about where these jobs are and where the jobs will be lost, a greater proportion will be lost in weaker economies. So this figure here shows the relationship between productivity in a local authority and the proportion of jobs that are at high or very high risk of job destruction. And we see here, again, there is a negative relationship between the two. If I could draw your attention to the slightly kind of JRF red circles there, those are the services and industrial legacy areas of the country. These are the areas that were most damaged by mass unemployment in the 1980s. We also see that these are the areas that are also likely to be hardest hit in the next wave of the pandemic, in the next wave of mass unemployment that is coming. These are areas like Doncaster, Mansfield and Hartlepool. These are places that have already been scarred by mass unemployment and never fully recovered from that. But it's worth noting that not only does mass unemployment scar places, it also scars people. So we also saw in the 1980s, the mass unemployment caused by that affected particularly men and men with fewer formal qualifications led to a permanent fall in their employment rates. Men with no formal qualifications had an employment rate of around 90% in 1980. That's now fallen to around 55% today. And so we see that unemployment scars peoples and places, and when it's mass unemployment, it scars them for a very long time indeed. There's an argument that says we should just let these firms go bankrupt, that we should just let this happen. And to say that while a structural change is going to occur anyway, we should allow that structural change to take place. One side says that by doing so, we encourage people into new sectors and don't keep them in zombie firms going forward. We disagree with that, and we disagree with that for two reasons. The first of which is, and has already been alluded to, is that people don't get jobs when there is mass unemployment. It leads to permanent scarring and damage to people and places. There simply aren't any jobs for people to go into. And the second is that there is no relationship between how much a firm was growing prior to the pandemic and the risk of job loss within that sector today. So here on this graph, we see the relationship between employment growth and pre-vaccine job risk within the industry. And we see prior to the pandemic, restaurants were growing strongly, and they have a large proportion of jobs at high or very high risk of job destruction. By contrast, or rather similarly, the computer programming and consultancy sector was also growing strongly and had a very low risk of job destruction. What we're saying is that if you get to a position in, let's say, March or June next year, when social distancing guidelines have been relaxed, we could find that firms that can thrive would have gone bankrupt already. And when those firms go bankrupt, that leads to a permanent loss. It's not just that, the firm goes bankrupt, there isn't any business left, and then when all of a sudden there's kind of more potential revenue out there, the firm springs back to life. There is a permanent cost to when a firm goes bankrupt. There's the relationships, the knowledge embodied within that firm, the branding as well, everything that goes beyond the book value of a firm, or they could be on the physical asset itself. That is lost forever. Now, that destruction could be creative if you can find a way to ensure people go into new jobs. But when that doesn't happen, that destruction is not creative. It is fundamentally uncreative. So what should we do in order to stop that happening? Well, we really have kind of two kind of broad policy ideas. The first one, which is about how to retain jobs in the next sector. So as we've said, or rather as I've said, these firms could thrive again once social distancing guidelines are relaxed, but we should try and protect them to ensure there is a firm left to grow after this pandemic passes. We therefore believe it's important to put in place a targeted version of the furlough scheme to support firms which have seen large losses of revenue due to COVID-19. It should also incentivize businesses to retain employees. So we ensure that firms don't have to pay a markup beyond what the government produces when an individual isn't working, as well as extend the job retention bonus as well. We should also support short working time. We should not allow firms to pay people on full-time furlough, except in those firms that are completely shut down due to COVID. And that's to keep people connected to the labour market and to stop people being scarred by the experience of unemployment and mass unemployment in particular. We also believe this should be temporary. Look, we could get to a place where by next March, we know what's going on. We know whether or not there's going to be a vaccine in place or an effective test, track and trace system, and we have a better idea of what the economy will look like in the future. But we also believe there should be a time when we make a decision on that, a final decision on that. We just believe that point should take place in the future. And finally, we believe in a local lockdown measure, that the full furlough scheme should be put in place where there are local lockdowns implemented. And finally, kind of the other two kind of policy jobs, the kind of two other policy measures we have in this report. The first two are really about helping people into employment. So targeted employment support, things like hiring credits to get people into work, as well as a new deal for adult education, helping people to get the skills that they need in order to kind of gain jobs in the labour market. And the final two are about direct job creation. The first of which is ensuring that employment increases in places like, for example, the social care sector and other social infrastructure areas that we require. And the final one is to use the shared prosperity fund to level up, to ensure that investment takes place in the areas that need it most and the places that will be hit the hardest. The point here is that there will be some unemployment, even with an extension of the furlough scheme, but we should try and minimize the amount of unemployment and the amount of damage that will take place to the economy. And so in short, really what we're saying here is that we really think the government should take action today to stop a wave of mass unemployment that will permanently scar low-paid people and places. And it should do so by retaining jobs through a targeted furlough scheme, as well as creating new jobs in the sectors that need them. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And I think I started there with a fairly worrying picture for who's most likely to be affected. And I think particularly kind of worth mentioning that the sectors we think are most likely to be affected in the next wave are where we saw poverty, in-work poverty most heavily concentrated kind of pre-pandemic. So it is a very kind of worrying picture for people in poverty. But also, you know, through this crisis so far, we have seen bold, impressive policy that has actually protected people from the brunt of things so far. So hopefully, looking towards the next stage of policy, we can see kind of similarly bold measures that do so again. I wonder what Gemma and Tony have to say on that. So we're going to go to Gemma next and hear your take on the question. Over to you, Gemma.
Thanks, Dave. I thought I would focus my remarks with a bit of looking at what's going on elsewhere in other countries. I can't claim to be an expert in all other countries' policies, but this has been a really interesting and unusual case where we've had a lot of countries hit by a very similar health shock, and that's translated into a very similar sort of economic shock. And it's therefore quite interesting to see how different countries have responded and how they're weighing up these kind of difficult decisions about how much should the government do versus allowing the sort of creative destruction of the market that Jeevan was talking about. COVID-19 has been really unusual, and I'm not going to use the word unprecedented because it's been used far too much, but the government's response in the first phase of the crisis, when the economies had to be shut down and social distancing had to be imposed, was incredibly unusual. We didn't see anything like that, the sort of response of the wage subsidy scheme when we had the global financial crisis, for example. In that sort of recession, the government didn't suddenly decide it needed to step in and keep people employed and on the books in a normal sort of recession. And the UK wasn't unusual in that sense. Most other countries followed a similar sort of approach, although there were some differences. So in a sense, the UK government's response in the first phase of the crisis was quite continental European in style, trying to subsidise wages to keep people in employment, similar to the sorts of longer standing programmes that Germany's had for its Kurzarbeit. France, many of the Scandinavian countries similarly have more long-standing programmes that look somewhat like that when employers can't keep their workers working, the government steps in to subsidise their wages. So the UK followed that quite continental European approach, slightly in contrast to what was going on in some other more Anglo-Saxon countries. So for example, if you look at Canada or Ireland or the US, they put much more of their initial response to the crisis onto increasing the generosity of unemployment benefits to increase the incomes of people who'd lost their jobs in that first phase of the crisis, rather than focusing their efforts on trying to keep people attached to the jobs that they had initially. So that was a slightly interesting contrast. The UK government went down that route in perhaps slightly contrary to the way the UK Treasury normally operates. But we're now into the second phase of response to the crisis. So as Jeevan was setting out, the question now is how do we support businesses as we go through the recovery phase, we start to remove the social distancing and the economic restrictions. And the question now is a little bit more difficult for the Treasury to weigh up, because we're now in a world where are we just trying to wait and tide businesses over until we can go back to the world we had pre-COVID? In which case perhaps you want to try and keep sustaining these jobs that were there before and wait until businesses can reopen as they were before? Or are we facing a situation in which COVID is leading to long-term structural changes, that the types of jobs that are going to exist in the future are not going to be exactly the same ones that we had before, and therefore we need to try and release people from the jobs and help them to reallocate to new sectors of the economy and find jobs elsewhere. And that's the real tension that the Treasury are now trying to weigh up. And I guess it feels in this second phase like the UK government is favouring more the idea that actually we can't keep supporting jobs that have no long-term future. There's a need to let the market operate again, let people reallocate to new businesses, allow that creative destruction to start happening. In contrast, I think, to where it appears that many continental European countries still are, which is that you've seen governments like those in France and Germany announce extensions to their wage subsidy schemes for at least another year, and where the weight seems to be more on the side of assuming that you want to sustain jobs and that the risk of losing jobs and risking long-term scarring is worse than potentially wasting taxpayer money, either propping up jobs that have no long-term future or just policies with a huge amount of dead weight. So in this second phase, I guess, sort of the UK government seems to have sort of three concerns in its mind. One is a sort of basic fiscal cost. The coronavirus job retention scheme and the self-employed income support scheme have been extremely expensive, kind of pumping £10 billion a month out the door. Can we keep doing that forever? Is that the best use of public money, or could we spend it more effectively elsewhere? Secondly, I think there's a concern about the value for money and the dead weight of these policies. Are we giving money to support jobs where actually those firms could well employ their workers without government support? Is it poorly targeted? And thirdly, do we need to allow markets to operate and allow more of that creative destruction to go on and workers to reallocate? I think if you were an omniscient ruler, ideally what you'd want to be able to do is identify all of those firms that have no long-term future. For their workers, you don't subsidise their wages, you help them retrain, help them find jobs elsewhere. For those firms that do have a long-term future, you want to help them stay attached to their current employer where they have firm-specific skills, and that's going to help the long-term future of the economy. I don't think no one is omniscient, and we had Andy Haldane saying in reports this morning that he thinks there has been lasting structural change to the economy. Some jobs won't be coming back, and therefore we need to end the job retention scheme to allow those people to reallocate elsewhere. I think I'm a bit less certain than him about how much lasting structural change we really have seen. As Jeevan rightly pointed out in his presentation, there are still significant areas of the economy that are being restricted by social distancing at the moment. I don't think we know yet how people's behaviour is going to be permanently changed, if at all, by coronavirus. If someone turned around tomorrow and said there's no longer any risk, to what extent will people go back to the same behaviours that they had back in February? I think I'm a bit less certain about that structural change. So in terms of, I guess there's a question about is ending the coronavirus job retention scheme in its entirety the only way to reduce those concerns you have about fiscal cost, poor value for money and creative destruction? Other countries give some sort of lessons there. I think in terms of the fiscal cost, I don't think there's much evidence that the UK government is currently at the limit of its borrowing capacity, and certainly as long as other countries are continuing to run quite high levels of borrowing to keep supporting their economies, then I think investors face a choice between a lot of advanced economies that are all running quite high deficits at the moment. So the UK doesn't at the moment stand out as being a particularly poor credit risk. On the sort of, can you target the money better or try and make sure that it's only firms that really need support who claim it? In some ways, I think the UK CJRS was quite well designed in that sense. So employers could only claim wage subsidies for workers who were not currently being used. So to the extent that, assuming employers face some other fixed costs, then presumably if they can get their businesses running again and bring people back, they have an incentive to do that, to try and generate revenues to cover their other fixed costs. Interestingly, in that sense, the UK scheme is kind of different from those that have been in operation in Canada, Australia and Ireland, where firms were given wage subsidies whether or not their employees were being used. So in Australia, you could get a wage subsidy even if you were keeping people employed and continuing to run your business. So there's obviously much more of a concern about the dead weight of the policy, because why wouldn't you apply for the wage subsidy if you could get it? And obviously, as the government subsidy in the UK has been reduced, there's an increasing incentive for employers to bring workers back if they possibly can, because they're having to cover more of the wage costs themselves. Ways that other countries have kind of tried to increase targeting, you do see, so for example, Singapore has offered higher levels of wage subsidy to aviation and tourism sectors that are thought to have been particularly hard hit. In Ireland, most recently, there have been extra tax cuts offered to those parts of the country that have been subject to localised lockdowns. So those sorts of approaches, either targeting more help on restricted sectors or more help on restricted areas, are approaches that the UK government hasn't yet gone down the route of. In terms of focusing on specific sectors, I think the Treasury response would be that it's very hard to define what sector a business is in. Lots of businesses have different arms to their operations, some of which may be more or less affected by social distancing. So I think the argument from the government side at the moment would be, actually it's quite hard to have a sector-specific support scheme. The one country I know does have that more sector-specific support is France, although my understanding of how they deal with that is that each business's proposal for why they need support is looked at in great detail, and they have to justify why each worker that they're claiming subsidies for can't be employed. That seems like quite a high admin burden approach to it. So I guess there's a question about, is there a different way of doing that? Finally, in terms of allowing markets to operate, I think, as I say, that the UK government is probably just taking a slightly different balance of risks approach to some other governments, perhaps favouring being more worried about the concern that you keep jobs locked in that have no long-term future versus the concern about losing jobs that will create long-term scarring. Just one final very quick thought on sort of other policies that you might want to throw into the mix in addition to all the ones that you've outlined. One other area where the UK stands out in terms of its labour market support from other countries is in terms of the generosity of unemployment benefits. So many other countries have unemployment benefit systems where, at least for a short period of time, people will get a benefit that's related to their previous earnings. Whereas in the UK, we essentially have a flat rate system. Some you get a bit more if you have kids, and some sort of covering of deemed housing costs. But being unemployed in the UK means that you take a very big hit to your income very quickly. And I guess there's a question about whether that entrenches some of the scarring from unemployment, whereas other countries, people have a little bit more time in which they have an income closer to their previous earnings to help them adjust, find a different job, rather than taking that huge financial hit initially. That hasn't been such an issue in the UK recently because we've had very high levels of employment. But I suppose there is a question in this next phase, as we see unemployment rates probably rise again, about whether that's the appropriate support structure in the UK.
Thanks very much, Gemma. Very interesting reflections, and I think you're right to emphasise the complete uncertainty that the government has to make decisions in at the moment. And I guess ideally you'd want to look forward a few years and see how it pans out in different countries, and I guess in a few years' time we'll have learned a lot of lessons for how to manage the next pandemic, but that doesn't really help the government make decisions now. Before I hand over to Tony, so I said about 15 minutes ago that you could upvote in Q&A. That was not working until now, but we have just fixed the problem. So please do have a look at the Q&A, start getting questions in ready for when Tony finishes, and have a look at other people's questions and start upvoting them now. So I'll hand over to Tony for your reflections.
Great, thanks, Dave. So I'll just make a couple of observations about where we are now, and then a few points about what I think we should do about it, which largely is agreeing with the points made in the Storm Ready report, which is a good place to start. So where are we now? We are facing, I think, really significant job losses and redundancies. And I think this is going to be far beyond what we experienced in 2008-9. You'll have seen the BBC report this morning. So by comparison, the last recession, there were about 300,000 redundancies at peak in spring 2009. Now we've got data on notifications to HMRC, the stuff that was reported this morning, going back to 2008. And the notifications to HMRC are already running at more than double what they were at the same period in the last recession. So I think it's very likely we're going to face at least 500,000 job losses in the autumn. To put that in perspective though, about 1.5 million people leave jobs every quarter anyway. So in practice, what this means is that we'll see redundancies increasing from about 1 in 10 of all job separations to potentially about 1/4 of all job separations. This is going to be a really significant impact, but it's in the context of a labour market where people do leave work and enter new work all the time, which leads on to the second point, which is that what matters even more, I think, than what happens with redundancies is whether we can create the jobs, and employers are creating the jobs for people to go to. So in the last...
Just lost you for a second there, Tony.
Dropped out there, Dave. Am I still here?
Yeah, dropped out there for 10 seconds.
So in the last quarter, new starts to employment ran at about 1.5 million, 1.6 million. So people are continuing to find work. But I think there's really significant concerns that that's not going to be in sufficient numbers for the numbers of people who are losing their jobs. So we will see unemployment rising. And also a lot of those jobs are going to be lower paid, less secure, and more likely to be, for example, temporary work and lower skilled work. And work we've been doing looking at vacancies in particular, funded by Joseph Rowntree Foundation, has showed that new vacancies, although they have started to come back, we're still running at about 1/3 lower in the most recent months than they were at the same time last year, which is starting to look a lot more like what happened in the last recession, actually, of a prolonged period of quite low vacancies, low job creation, and quite suppressed demands for labour. The third point, though, is this point about the risk of long-term scarring, which Jeevan touched on. Now, in the last couple of months, we've seen 2 million new claimants for universal credit, 2 million in the last 3 months alone. And that's 4 times higher than what we'd see in normal times. And I think that means by the middle of next year, we're likely to have long-term claimant unemployment. So people who've been continuously claiming universal credit in the searching for work group, the unemployed group, is going to be at least 700,000, probably about 800,000 by the middle of next year, and probably on a trajectory to continue rising. Now, to put that in perspective, that would be easily the highest level of long-term unemployment we've had since the 1990s. It'll be about double the level of long-term unemployment we had in the last recession. We're facing really significant labour market shock, and we're not particularly prepared for it. And those people who find themselves long-term unemployed are more likely to be older, to live in more disadvantaged areas, to be low.
Wait till we've lost you again, Tony. If you're coming back soon. Oh. Just wait. You seem to be back with us, Tony. We just lost you for 10-20 seconds again.
Sorry about that. So I was just saying that I think those people who are long-term claimant unemployed are more likely to be older in more disadvantaged areas and so on. So I think what do we do about it? I say there's 4 or 5 priorities for action, which is very much picking up the points in the earlier presentation. Firstly, we do need to do what we can to minimise job losses, but recognising that a lot is going to happen anyway and is already sort of baked in. And a lot of these job losses are happening because of long-term structural changes brought about by home working, by internet shopping, and by changes in demands, which employers will do whether there's a short-time working scheme or not. But nonetheless, I think with a short-time working scheme, with some kind of subsidy scheme, we can definitely minimise and reduce those levels of job losses, those levels of redundancies. And I think we do need to do that in the short term, at least, as in over the next 6 months, potentially the next 12 months. And I think it will also provide some financial support for those sectors and industries that are trying to weather the storm. but recognising we may need more. I mean, as one of the questions there in the question section was about what about the entertainment industry, for example. I think you look at hospitality, you look at creative industries in particular. I think a wage subsidy scheme may not be enough to support viable firms. They're also going to need help with their rates, they're going to need help with other overheads, and so we mustn't, I think, lose sight of that too. But recognising Gemma's points about, we can't pick winners. Second really important priority here, though, I think, is about how we're supporting those on low to middle incomes who see their hours reduce. Now, I would argue there's very few impediments at the moment to employers reducing hours, and we saw this happen in the 2008-9 recession, to a really significant extent, without any form of short-time working scheme. So I think a short-time working scheme will help. It will help employers to make those decisions, but I think overwhelmingly that is likely to happen. I think we're already seeing it happen, with or without a scheme. Now, ironically, in the last recession, the tax credit system was a huge support for low-income households who saw their hours reduce. But it was in the face of huge political opposition, and we saw really significant cuts to welfare in the early 2010s, and the burden of those cuts actually fell on working households. The reductions in welfare spending were far greater for working than for non-working households. So I do think we mustn't lose sight of the need to increase universal credit generally, picking up Gemma's point about support for the unemployed. But I do think in particular, looking at how we can target some of that at low-income working households, particularly households with children, I think is going to be really important. It's the most progressive and the fairest way we can support low-income households, and it ensures that people get that access and they're not just reliant on their employer applying for support. I think I would make just a related point as well, which is we also need to ensure that we're providing financial support for those who are required to shield or who see their workplaces closed due to or who see their workplaces closed due to local lockdowns. A couple of really quick final points. Stimulating new hiring, I very much agree. I think the biggest risk in the recovery is going to be a prolonged slump in hiring as employers downsize, and they do that by trying not to make layoffs. I think most employers don't want to make redundancies, so we'll instead be reducing hours and instituting recruitment freezes. And again, this will feel very familiar to 2009, 2011. So we do need to avoid the mistakes of adding to that through cutting public expenditure as we're entering the recovery phase, because the public sector and public spending generally can play an important part in maintaining recruitment, maintaining employment. But I think we also need to do more to incentivise hiring. I think the subsidy scheme, the sorts of things the report's talking about, I think will make a big difference to that. I think we should also look at how we can reduce labour costs, particularly through, for example, national insurance. And then final point, how we target support the most disadvantaged groups, people and places, I think is going to be key. And that's going to require central government working much more collaboratively with local government and local employers and local bodies, and not trying to design everything from Westminster. We need good national policy, but we also need really good quality local leadership and integration.
Great, thanks very much, Tony. Another set of really interesting reflections and useful on what we need. So the questions have started coming in via Q&A, which is great. So I'm going to go to some of those now. So what I'll try and do is take them in sort of themes. So we've got a couple to do with the furlough scheme first. So get those done, then we'll move on to kind of broader questions about lots of the other policy bits that people have been mentioning so far. So I'll put two questions out there on furlough and give you each a kind of question to jump in on either of them, an option to jump in on either of them. So first, there's a kind of question about the cost of that and is it really worth it? And specifically here, good question from, let me see who's come from Paula Grayson, about saying that according to whistleblowers, about 50% of organisations claiming the job retention scheme so far have actually had people coming into work. So there's a kind of big fraud risk to do with the scheme. And also, obviously, it's been a huge cost so far. So it's, can we carry on with that indefinitely? And then a second question around the furlough scheme is, I wonder what you think. So how does this depend on what you think the future path of the economy is likely to be? So if you're relatively optimistic and think there's going to be a V-shaped recovery, what does that imply about what you should do with the furlough scheme? Or if you think we're going to be in a much deeper, prolonged recession, kind of what does that imply about your best options here? So two questions on the furlough scheme. I wonder if we'll go to Jeevan first, perhaps on the cost of it. What do you think, Jeevan?
Yeah, more than happy to take that. So in terms of if you have a full extension of the furlough scheme, so as it stands at the moment, NISA, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, says that would cost about £10 billion in net terms. So when you take into account kind of the tax paid as well as the kind of reduced social security payments, that's for a full furlough scheme. So to extend this targeted scheme we're going to talk about, well, first of all, it's a shorter period of time and also a less kind of broadly targeted scheme in general. So it should be cheaper than that. What we also don't look at there is the benefits. The benefits of stopping mass unemployment. I think the scar has been touched on by both Gemma and Tony, that we need to, that leaves us with a long kind of decades-long cost if we let that happen, right? Or it can do in certain areas for certain people and places. And so the benefits of stopping unemployment rise really rapidly are likely to be much greater than the costs, which are comparatively small. As a kind of a side point, I would notice that, you know, the UK's borrowing costs are an all-time low. We're being paid by the bond markets to lend out money to them, you know, as borrowing has increased. And so really the kind of financing constraint doesn't seem to be there. And I think that was picked up earlier in the comments as well. In terms of the fraud point, I'll touch on that very briefly, which is to say that I think you want to have a system that is more generous in targeting. So you're getting more people, as many people as possible, but that doesn't preclude kind of strong enforcement from HMRC as well. HMRC can make it very clear that people who claim it fraudulently will be kind of punished in the full force of the law. So like a generous but well-enforced scheme, I think is a good place to go for that. And I'm happy to touch on the future path of the economy a bit quickly, which is just to say, I don't know what the future path of the economy will look like, but I think it's better to think of where we sit in March next year, given the costs are so small, and we can kind of reevaluate at that point. And no matter where we go, a kind of a slower transition, I will stop some of the damaging costs we've seen from kind of large rises of unemployment in the past. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. And Gemma, you sort of touched on kind of lots of the Treasury kind of conversations that I'm sure will be going on internally about costs. I wonder what you think about the future path of the economy and how that affects the decision.
Sure. I mean, I guess these things are related. So I think the future path of the economy is not independent from the decisions you make around the wage subsidy scheme for the reasons that we've talked about. That if you do end up with people losing jobs and ending up in long-term unemployment a la the 1980s, then that can damage the future path of the economy as well. So the sort of overall fiscal sustainability depends not just on the cash that you spend on the scheme, but on the future growth of the economy, sort of the money that will be available to repay that debt. And so to some extent, the better you can do in terms of managing job losses and getting people back into work, then the less of a fiscal burden you end up with in the longer term. I think it's also, it does depend what you think the future path of the economy is, but I think it depends on the story that you're telling about why we bounce back quickly or why there is a more prolonged adjustment. I think the bounce back quickly story would be one where the threat of coronavirus goes away quickly and therefore people can get back to normal quite quickly, and it turns out that people's habits haven't changed that much, in which case there's much less restructuring that needs to be done. I guess a story that there's a more prolonged period of low growth could be either or both of two things. One, that the threat of coronavirus just remains around for a lot longer, so things can't go back to normal. The other related point would be that coronavirus has done more permanent change to the economy, that we have much more restructuring and that takes time to come through. And that could be a bit self-perpetuating, because the longer that people are forced to do things differently, the more likely it is perhaps that they don't go back to doing things the way they did before. So I think if we are in that longer, slower growth period, more restructuring needed, then that does suggest that you need to do more shifting. Just on the one point that's sort of related to this that I didn't mention earlier, I think even within sectors, it is clear that there are some businesses that are back up and running and have brought workers back from furlough. So I think that, and as Tony said, that there are constantly businesses going under and being replaced by better businesses, particularly in things like the restaurant industry. There are loads of restaurants will open, not last very long, and shut down again. So I think we do need to be a bit aware that there is a kind of normal process of turnover of businesses and jobs that isn't a bad thing. The question is, as Tony said, whether there are other jobs for those people to go to, and whether the circumstances are such that will be other businesses coming in to fill that gap.
Yeah, excellent point. All that's kind of very useful reflections, and I think takes us nicely on to next set of questions. So keen to make sure we get through a few of them. And that's, so the set of questions really about, so what policies you need in place to support people to make that transition. So we know some increase in unemployment is inevitable, and we do have to try and support people into new jobs as quickly as possible. So I wonder if, kind of thinking about what the government has announced so far in their plan for jobs, there's kind of an interesting contrast here between what's announced there and the furlough scheme. So with the furlough scheme introduced immediately in lockdown, kind of very new, bold policy, whereas what was included in the plan for jobs, thinking about kind of the Kickstarter scheme, was very similar to what we did in the last recession. So I kind of wonder thoughts on kind of whether we need new innovative policies to be announced next, kind of in addition to the plan for jobs. But if I go through kind of some of the questions which I think are really useful, we've got the question from Alex Waddington about what new policies do you think the government needs to have on skills to support the structural changes to the labour market? Very important issue of how we let skills adjust. Secondly, a specific question on digital skills from Tracy Fishwick. So lack of digital access if you're on UC, huge cost of Wi-Fi at home, people don't have laptops, you know, so what practical things do people need in place to kind of navigate the world we're in at the moment? And then thirdly, a question about specific groups affected and what might help them adjust. So this has come from Claudia Dumuth, and it's so we've got so there's an example of people, unemployed older men in coalfield areas, kind of needing support. What can we do to help some of those places and people kind of most affected by this? Wonder if a lot of issues there, but come to Tony to break off some of those.
I can have a go at trying to. I can try and do all of them. Maybe that might be a bit ambitious.
Go for it.
So I think there's a really important point here about. So coming back to the plan for jobs. So I think the plan for jobs was really, really good on the extra investment in support for people out of work to find new work. It was less good on how we were going to ensure that there were these new jobs for people to go to, and also about what was going to happen for people who were in jobs that could be protected. So you know, it's taking quite a big punt on the economy, on a V-shaped recovery in effect. And I think in the spending review we're going to have to address that. I don't think we actually need much more by way of investment. We do need more by way of design, but probably not much more by way of investment in kind of active labour market and employment support. But I think there's two things that really stood out. One is this point about, you know, job retention, which we've covered, but the other is about safe returns to work, which picks up on another point that Tracy made in her question. You know, the government is so inconsistent on what constitutes a safe return to work and the process that employers are meant to follow and how that should play out locally. And you're having a massive push on returns to the office when most people, you know, twice as many people are now travelling to a workplace as staying at home, and they're not, for the most part, working in offices. So how we make sure construction sites, food processing, hospitality, you know, manufacturing sites are safe is so, and I know it's incredibly hard to do, but it's so important given the sorts of jobs in particular that many people who are out of work will be looking to move into. And I do think that means, you know, really investing in the support that's available through local authority, health and safety services, because a lot of this is still delivered through local authorities, as well as nationally with HSE and through ACAS and other organisations that can provide practical help to employers to make workplaces safe and then enforce it. So that's, I think, a really, really important point, because we've got to give people confidence that workplaces are safe. On some of the employment measures, I think, the point about skills, I think that's where there's real scope for innovation. There's really good examples of sector-based, slightly more intensive than the sector-based work academy model, which is a very short intervention, which does work. You know, it's got good evaluation evidence. But there's really good examples of more intensive and expansive sector-based approaches, particularly in the US, like the work advanced model is probably the best one. And that's been really successful, in particular in IT and digital, which is a massive growth area, where there's huge potential if you can get people in early, you know, in sort of entry-level roles. There's real opportunities for progression. So how we can work much better with employer bodies, and I think that means really rooting that locally within like city regions in particular, where that can be convened effectively. We've got the convening power of local government and combined authorities and so on. I think, you know, is really critical. And just a final point is, I think some of these other points, the digital one I think is a really good one. as a good example of why I think investing in ensuring that money is flowing locally as well, and we're not just doing this all through large-scale black box, nationally commissioned prime contracted programs. I mean, my ideal model, I think, would be that we do have nationally commissioned employment support for the long-term unemployed, delivering intensive one-to-one help to get back to work. But then we route other money, as much money as we can, through local partnerships to commission the wraparound support, buy the laptops, the digital training, all the sorts of things that will be needed locally. And then let's make that system work better between the nationally commissioned services and then locally commissioned, tailored, intensive, additional support. And I think, we've got time to get that right for next year, but we do need to kind of start on that now. And DWP in particular need to open up that conversation much more, I think, with local government and local partners.
Thanks very much, Tony. And I wonder if we come to Jeevan on that set of questions, kind of what do we need to do to support people into new jobs? Maybe what can we learn from previous crises, or what do we think on that?
Yeah, more than happy. I think Tony did a really good job of taking a lot of the points there. I think the first thing is, I think we covered on it, but like stopping mass unemployment from the 1980s and why it's so important, which is to say that, I mean, as we touched upon, and I'll touch upon the Coalfield area thing in particular, but when we saw mass unemployment, it led to long-term scarring for people and places. And it's worth thinking a little bit about why that was. From the individual perspective, a long-term unemployment kind of hits you psychologically, both because you're not working, but also from your loss of income. That kind of hits you as a human being, as an individual. And we should never forget like what it would mean to be sitting at home doing nothing for a really, really long period of time. I mean, people found it frustrating during lockdown, but they still had jobs to do. Now, imagine that, but except you don't have a job. It starts to become a lot more difficult. Your social life is closed off, and that's why it's so important. As well as that, I would think about how you would stop that happening. And I think you also need to really think about direct job creation. So it's not just about how people into new jobs, but also ensuring that jobs are there and making sure that does happen. Two other things I want to touch upon as well. Now's a really good time to have a green recovery. So the government has already committed to net zero by 2050. I know the interim net zero report is being produced before the spending review, but you have a lot of labour which could be potentially need to be employed, very cheap borrowing costs. I know Rishi Sunak already announced £3 billion for home insulation, but there's a lot more green infrastructure to be put in place. And on the point about digital skills, yeah, I think digital skills are really important. I'd also say that I remember the last election, obviously Labour was ambassador for the free broadband policy. What I would say is the infrastructure you need in a world of social distancing might look slightly different than the infrastructure you needed in November 2019. And so we should definitely think about what does it mean to live in the 21st century? What kind of infrastructure do we need? And what are the skills that need to be there in place as well?
Thanks. And I'm keen to make it more through more questions. But Gemma, do you want to add anything to what Jeevan and Tony said, what's missing from Plan for Jobs?
Just a really quick point specifically about older workers. I think the real success of the labour market in the last 20 years has been the huge increase in employment rates of older workers, reversing a lot of what we saw post-1980s when we had this huge drop in employment of particularly older men. So I think the Plan for Jobs focused quite a lot on getting jobs for young people, which is really very, very important because obviously they have a long work future ahead of them. But I think older workers are clearly a group who are potentially at risk of job losses, particularly in some sectors, and who may find it harder to find jobs, and they therefore then risk having many years out of work. They can't find new jobs pre-retirement.
Thanks. So we've got, just checking the questions, final questions coming in, we've got kind of 3 or 4 minutes left for questions. So try and make sure we get through as many as we can. These ones aren't grouped together, so I'll just come to you quickly on one of them. I've got a question from Joanna Young about how likely do you think it is? So Gemma, you very rightly mentioned strengthening the universal credit and social security system as something we should certainly be doing to protect people from coming wave of unemployment. Joanna Young asks, how likely do you think it is that the government will make those changes to the benefits system to cope with that rise in unemployment? I'll come to you on that one, Gemma.
So do you think we've seen increased generosity of some bits of the benefit system in response to COVID? I think there are reasons to think it's extremely likely those will become permanent. Some of that increased generosity was being called for before COVID, and trying to reverse that increase in generosity will literally mean taking money away from low-income families. I think that'll be very hard for the government to do. Whether there will be further more substantial changes, I don't think we've seen any indications of where the government is thinking on that. I think it is a very important question for the future.
Thanks very much. Just on that point, Tony, have you got any reflections on, what will be done to the universal credit system?
No, I agree. I think it's going to be an uphill battle for me to convince anyone in the Treasury to increase work allowances or to increase the child element. But I think we should. Continue to call for it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much. So I've got a question one thing we haven't mentioned so far is a question about health inequalities and how that overlaps with some of the economic inequalities kind of outlined in the report. I wonder if we can come to Jeevan on that, just to talk about the links between those two.
Yeah, so in those former industrial areas in the country, the places countries with the red dots in the graph beforehand, those are areas that also have the lowest life expectancy, the second highest rate of child poverty, the lowest rate of graduates, and the highest proportion on incapacity benefits as well as ESA, including ESA. And so the short answer is it will cause more damage in places that have the worst health outcomes at the moment. And the reason why those places have the worst health outcomes, or at least in part, is due to the mass unemployment in the 1980s. So it wasn't just like former physical injuries. There was some of that for sure, but a lot of it is mental health and scarring through time. And then also that self-perpetuates through time. So what happens is young people grow up in a town that is kind of more economically deprived, and they go to university and they leave, as do graduates. And there's like a self-reinforcing logic of the entire kind of health-based system of an area.
Okay, thanks very much. Yes, Gemma, you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, just very quickly, perhaps a slightly more positive note. I think for some people with health impairments, the new ways of remote working in some industries do actually help them to participate more fully. So there may be some slight silver lining to this, that workplaces have been forced to try some of those adaptations that perhaps they were somewhat unwilling to adopt in the past. And that might make it easier for some people with health impairments to participate in work.
Absolutely, good point. And presumably there's a big opportunity there where you can encourage that to happen. There's no excuse to not be able to do that now. So I do have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but I wanted to come to each of you very quickly on one last thought, which is I wonder, so we don't know what's coming in the next few months. We've talked about a coming storm. I wonder, we're in a very different situation to previous crises. I wonder how optimistic or pessimistic you're feeling about kind of how big it's going to be. Maybe a tough question, but I'll come to Tony to give very quick thoughts on that.
So look, I'm sort of an eternal optimist, and I remain optimistic about next year, maybe the second half of next year now. There's two immediate issues. One is the rate of growth of new infections. This continues to double every week, which is more or less what's happening. If by the end of this month we've got 20,000-30,000 new infections, if by the end of October it's 100,000 plus, then we're going to be in a very different territory over the winter, and we just don't, so suppressing the virus must continue to be the top priority. And the other issue is, of course, Brexit on the 1st of January, which is going to have really disruptive effects on a lot of employers. But looking further ahead, I'm confident for the recovery when it comes, in part because of the support measures that have been put in place. We've pumped a lot of money ultimately into the economy over the last couple of months, and that's helped to shore things up. And I think, and I do think we'll be relatively well placed, I hope, when we get control of the virus, and when we're on a more even keel, sort of politically and economically in next year.
Thanks. Gemma, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the recovery?
I think I'm probably feeling a bit nervous, because I think, as I agree with Tony, there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly what other challenges we're going to be facing. I suppose to be more positive, I think the last 6 months have shown the power of government to really support the economy in very wide-ranging ways. So I think we've seen what good, well-designed policy can do. There is a danger of designing policy badly and getting things wrong. But if you get policy right, you can do quite a lot. So I suppose that'd be my positive take.
A
good important one. Very quickly, Jeevan, your thoughts?
I think similar. I'm optimistic that we can deal with it, right? The challenge is large. What the large we face is probably the Second World War, right? But I'm optimistic we can deal with it. And also because the Treasury in particular made some really good decisions so far. They stopped a massive rise of unemployment. It was a bold, compassionate policy to stop that massive rise and the damage it would cause. I kind of have faith that we will kind of continue to do so and deal with the challenge ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think you're right, we're in unprecedented times, but as Gemma and Jibin have said, we have learned the power of government policy in recent times, so that does give hope for the future. So I've left myself approximately 0 time to wrap up, but I was not planning to do a wrap up anyway. Just wanted to finish by saying thanks very much to all the speakers today for what I think is a really interesting and important discussion. And to say that, yeah, this is the 4th and last in our series. Previous ones have looked further ahead on how we level up the economy, how we make work more secure, and how we can build the social housing that we need right now. All those webinars are on the JRF YouTube channel, so please do go and have a look if we've piqued your interest today. And then the last thing to say is that we are always looking to work with others on interesting and important topics such as this. So again, if you found it of interest, please do get in touch and we can carry on the discussion further. But with that, we'll finish the webinar for today. Thanks very much to speakers and everyone else who's joined us for the discussion. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thank you.